Hi everyone, and welcome to episode 27 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danielle Sobalski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. For many of us, the path to our interest in medieval history began in historical fiction or fantasy novels, and for a good number of the people listening today, that love for the past was sparked by a novel by Guy Gavriel Kay. Guy is the author of 14 novels that range from high fantasy to reality with a twist, most of which are based in a version of the Middle Ages. His works include Tigana, The Lions of Al-Rassan, the award-winning Isabel, and Children of Earth and Sky. His work has become so well-known and well-loved that in 2014, Guy was named to the Order of Canada. So when I heard that he had a new novel coming out, I thought it was the perfect time to bring him on the podcast. I caught up with Guy in the heart of downtown Toronto to speak with him about his latest novel, A Brightness Long Ago. Here's our conversation about the new book, why he loves Renaissance Italy, and why he enjoys being a moving target. So thanks for joining me. It's great to have you on the podcast. I'm really excited to be talking about the new book.
It's nice to be here, Danielle.
So the new book that you've just written is called A Brightness Long Ago, and it takes place not in the world as we know it, but in a similar world that is like Renaissance Italy, right?
Yep. I've been accused, more or less, although generally kindly accused of having invented a form, which is to say a merger of the fantastic and history with a tilt towards the historical aspect of it. Somebody once said that I write history with a quarter turn to the fantastic, and I'm comfortable with that description. So this is not 15th century Italy, but it is very much grounded in evoking that time and place.
And you've worked in this sort of 15th century Italy before. So what brought you back to that for this book?
I'm not sure. I think in terms of what brings me back, I think that I would frame it in my own mind more as what's not to love about this time and place. And when I wrote Children of Earth and Sky, which was my previous novel, it was covering something of the same ground, but most of it further east towards what we would call the Balkans, and then into Istanbul, Constantinople. This one was specifically inspired by reading about the feud between two brilliant condottieri, military warlords, who absolutely loathed each other. And this is Sigismondo Malatesta and Federico Montefeltro. And that hatred was an anomaly of sorts, because one of the things you learn about warfare in the Renaissance in Italy is that the war leaders took great pains not to fight. When you fought, people died, horses died, expenses went up, and your whole game was economic. You were a fighter for hire with your armies that you paid for, and when people got killed, it was bad for the economic aspect of your business. So they worked very hard not to actually fight. In fact, the next spring, when the war season resumed, you might be fighting on the other side of a conflict with the person you were arraigned against the year before. So this particular personal intensity of dislike, if you will, which usually meant they were almost always, if not always, on opposite sides of conflicts, fascinated me as one starting point for this novel.
Yeah, you definitely see this enmity between these two mercenary captains, and they're more than that. They're very, very powerful, and it kind of drives the story. But it's interesting in that you don't actually have them as narrators in any sense. They are kind of peripheral figures, but the plot very much moves around them. So why did you decide to work kind of around them instead of directly setting it in the voice of one of these mercenaries?
It's a good question, and there's no... Always be suspicious when an author tells you after the fact exactly why he or she did something. It could be made to sound eminently rational and lucid and worked out, when in fact a lot of it is instinct after, in your 14th novel in my case, there's a certain amount of instinctive awareness of what might suit best to tell a story. In this case, one of the themes of the novel has to do with memory and recollection and looking back. And the principal narrator is a man in middle age at the time he's telling us the story, 25 years later, but he was a very young man just entering, if you will, the theater of the world at the time the bulk of the narrative takes place. And I wanted to write a book where someone thinks about, why do we remember some things? Why are some people, some moments so vivid in our recollection, and others that might have been as important in the way our lives played out don't hold that incandescent brightness for us? So that was one of the themes, and that required that narrator from the outside remembering not only these two men, but two women that he encountered in that same time frame 20 years before. And that outside viewpoint is also really useful, I've always found, for letting a reader share the sense of learning about the people that the novel is anchored by. If a character in the book is learning about these situations, the reader comes in through the viewpoint of that character, and there's a fusion, there's a harmony between the character's discovery and the reader's discovery.
And I like that. I liked, as an English major, how subtly you come across some of these details. And you don't make a big deal of things like, so the main character is Daniel, and you don't make a big deal of how he ends up getting to the positions that he's in, because he kind of stumbles through circumstance into, major plot points, and this happens in part because of his education. And so for, as a medievalist, you see these little details like having an education gets you a little bit further in ways that are not necessarily linear, and these sort of subtle ways at getting at these actual events in history where things could happen in weird circumstances, because even if you're born poor, for example, you might have some opportunities. So why did you pick somebody who was sort of a tailor's son, who kind of makes good by accident? What spoke to you about that?
Well, we're back to my caveat about don't believe a word I say after the book is done. I've been interested for the last several books in trying to do what, as a historian, you will know, became a strong new vein in historical research in the 50s and 60s, starting in France principally with the Annales group, where they started to try to find ways to tell the stories of people whose stories tended not to be told. This would, for example, obviously be the stories of women, trying to find those in the written records, or if they weren't in the written records, looking for them in unusual, unexpected places, like records of births and deaths in a parish. What names were common in a given part of France at a given time, and then working out why. That became a fascination for me early in my own writing about history. So if I'm using a figure who begins from relatively modest beginnings, that dovetails with that interest, I'll add something. And this is where I love research. My favorite part of writing is the research, because I'm just learning things. I don't have responsibilities to do anything with it yet. Tailors in Renaissance Italy were relatively higher on the social scale than most other craftspeople, because, and if you think about it, you'll get this, tailors went into the homes of the aristocrats and the wealthy. They went into the chambers of the men and women they were dressing and fitting clothing for. They were confided in by these men and women. And so they had, by virtue of being invited into the home, that not exalted status, that would be a silly thing to say, but an enhanced status. And that, when I discovered that, that was a penny dropped, if you will, as to what I would make my protagonist's father because he meets the father, meets enough men of influence in his trade that the fact that he has a bright, promising lad for a son can go through the ripple effect of accident where someone with influence recommends Guadagno be sent to a school. And by the way, that school was modeled on historical reality as well, where they did admit some children of artisans and craftspeople, not just the children of the aristocrats. It comes together if you take enough time to let a book gestate, for me.
Yeah, and it is reminiscent of history where it's all about who you know and accident, and that's how things happen. And so I thought that was nice. In the story, it didn't feel forced, which I really quite liked. But let's get to the women for a second, because there are several powerful women in this, and Adria is probably the main woman in this, and she gets to have a little bit more agency, and this is permitted by her family, which I really kind of appreciated, because I think there are a lot more women on the margins of what we say women were allowed to do than most history books would say. So what made you pull this woman character again? Like, I'm asking you what made you do this, but what's interesting to you about Adria as a character?
We could go for the entire length of the podcast talking about this one. I'll start by saying what I don't do.